Everyone thought Jack Turner rebuilt that villa to escape his guilt, the soldier who once lost everything to fire. But when his dog dug up what the ashes concealed, the real story began to burn again. Like and subscribe if you believe some fires never die until the truth is found. The train exhaled a tired breath as it pulled into the small coastal town of Florence, Oregon. The kind of place that still smelled of salt and rust. Jack Turner stepped down with one hand gripping a worn duffel and the other clutching a folded blueprint, his boots landing heavy on the platform. He looked older than 52, his eyes holding that pale stillness veterans carry, the kind that's seen too much fire, too much silence. He had been a firefighter in the Marines, trained to run into flames when others ran out. But 10 years ago, one fire refused to let him go. The fire that took his wife and little girl. The fire he had started. That was what the papers said, what the neighbors whispered, what he never denied. Because it was easier to live with blame than to live with questions. Now, the house he came to rebuild wasn't theirs. That home had been reduced to ash long ago. This one was a villa perched above the sea cliffs, burned hollow 5 years back, left to rot since. People called it cursed. He called it a second chance to stand in front of fire and not flinch. The road that led there curved through gray pines and salt-blown fences. He drove the old Chevy he kept in Florence up the final hill, and the villa came into view, a skeleton of what once was. The roof was half-gone beams, blackened glass eaten by heat. Yet, even from a distance it had shape defiance. He parked engine coughing into silence. The ocean stretched wide behind it, endless and cold. He could almost hear the hiss of waves over flame. "All right," he murmured, stepping out. "Let's see if I can still build something." A bark echoed from the truck bed. Shadow, a German shepherd with fur fading from sable to gray, leapt down landing with military precision. His old rescue partner. Once they had pulled people from burning buildings together, now it was only each other left to save. Shadow trotted ahead, tail still and disciplined as if inspecting the perimeter. Jack followed. The air around the villa still smelled faintly of smoke, or maybe it was memory. Inside, the walls were stripped to studs, plaster crumbling at the touch. He ran his hand across the charred wood, black dust staining his fingers. It was like touching a scar, dead, but still part of the body. "We'll start with the bones," he told the dog, though his voice trembled. "Everything else can come later." He set down his duffel and unrolled the blueprint on a makeshift table, a door laid across 2 sawhorses. Measurements, notes, estimates all neat, almost military. Jack worked like he was on duty again, his movements precise, efficient. The rhythm steadied him like drills used to. But when the sun dipped behind the sea shadows stretched long across the blackened floor, and for a moment he saw the flicker of that old night, the flames climbing the hallway, his wife's scream, the smell of burning paint and hair. He closed his eyes hard. "Not here," he whispered. "Not again." Shadow pressed against his leg, steadying him. Jack's breath slowed. The dog's warmth was the only thing that kept the ghosts from crowding too close. He didn't rebuild for beauty. He rebuilt for penance. The locals said he was out of his mind. That old Marine, they'd mutter living in ruins like the fire didn't get enough of him. But Jack didn't mind the pity. Pity was still better than fear. Fear had followed him for years. Fear of fire, fear of stillness, fear that maybe he deserved it. The villa to him wasn't a house. It was a battlefield, and he had come back to face the one enemy he'd never conquered himself. As darkness settled, he built a small campfire outside the villa, more ritual than warmth. The flames were low, tame, obedient, nothing like the inferno he remembered. Shadow lay beside him, head on paws, eyes watching the horizon. Jack lifted a tin mug of cold coffee, staring at the fire's reflection, trembling inside. "You and me, old boy," he murmured. "One more try." The fire crackled. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't look away. By morning, the coastal fog had rolled in thick, swallowing the cliffs in a sheet of pale gray. Jack woke to the low hum of the wind pressing against the villa's half-rebuilt frame, the boards creaking like an old man's bones. He poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the kind soldiers kept long after service, and stood at the threshold watching the ocean breathe. The world was quiet, except for the rhythmic crash of waves and the faint hiss of wind cutting through the charred timbers. Shadow lay near the steps, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but never asleep. Jack took a slow sip, then picked up his gloves. Today, he planned to strip more of the interior walls, checking the studs for damage before laying new insulation. It wasn't the kind of work most people did alone, but solitude was the only company he trusted. He pried away the first panel, the sound of nails giving way sharp and dry. Smoke stains streaked upward like ghosts climbing to the ceiling. When he reached the outlet embedded in the beam, he paused. The charring was deep, not just surface scorch, it had burned inward from the wires themselves. He leaned closer, studying the direction of the black marks. This wasn't how a house burned from open flame. It started inside. He knew that pattern too well. For years, he had believed his own fire began outside from the lighter left on the table catching the curtains. That's what the investigators told him, what he told himself to avoid digging deeper. But this was the opposite. Inside out, not outside in. A slow, hidden rot that waited until it found enough heat to become catastrophe. He pulled back, exhaling through his teeth, steady-controlled. His hands didn't shake, but his breath did. Faulty wiring, he murmured. Same signature. He decided to confirm it. After lunch, he drove into town, Shadow's head out the passenger window, the wind flattening his ears. In Florence, everyone knew when a stranger bought nails. The hardware store sat beside a post office, and a diner, its sign faded to pale red. When Jack entered, the bell above the door jingled, and the man behind the counter, broad-shouldered with a beard the color of dust, nodded in recognition. "You're the fellow rebuilding the Grant place," the man said. "Heard it burned bad." Jack nodded. "You remember what caused it?" The shopkeeper scratched his chin, never got the full story. But I do remember the county inspector talking about the wiring. Said it wasn't grounded right. Company that sold that wire got hit with a recall a few years later. Dangerous stuff melts from the inside before the breaker even flips. Jack's gaze sharpened. "What company? Western Electrics, I think. Out of Portland?" The name lodged itself in Jack's mind like a spark on dry wood. He thanked the man bought supplies he didn't really need and drove back in silence. The road wound along the coast, the sea glinting through the fog, steady and endless. Inside the truck, Shadow watched him with that same patient intensity, as if reading thoughts he didn't dare speak. That night, the wind returned, strong, shaking the loose siding of the villa. Jack was in the living room, checking structural joints, when he heard a faint metallic ticking, like two coins knocking together inside the wall. He froze, the flashlight beam trembling over the blackened wood. It wasn't the house settling. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost electrical. He crouched, pressing his ear close to the panel. The sound came from behind the outlet he had inspected earlier. He grabbed his screwdriver, pried the cover free, and the smell of burnt insulation met him immediately. Sharp chemical wrong. The wiring inside was a patchwork of mismatched colors and melted joints. Someone had repaired it badly years ago, connecting wires with tape instead of caps. A shortcut may be done quietly to avoid reporting the damage. He touched the wire gently. It crumbled under his finger. Whoever had done this hadn't cared if it lasted. Jack sat back on his heels, the flashlight steady in his hand. The villa had burned from the inside not by accident, but because someone tried to hide a problem rather than fix it. He stared at the exposed outlet, his reflection faint in the metal faceplate. And for a moment it felt like he was staring into the night 10 years ago, the hiss, the flash, the roar that followed. Only now he wondered if what had haunted him all these years wasn't guilt, but ignorance. Outside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the frame, and the ocean answered in long, heavy breaths. Shadow stood near the doorway, ears up, tail stiff, sensing his unease. Jack set the tools down carefully, his voice low but steady. "We're not done here, boy." The dog tilted his head, waiting. Jack turned off the flashlight, the darkness swallowing the room except for the faint glimmer of distant lightning over the sea. The sound of metal tapping inside the wall returned, softer this time, as if reminding him it was still there, still alive beneath the surface. The following afternoon carried a stillness that felt wrong for the coast. The wind had died, and even the gulls seemed to avoid the cliff line. Jack worked shirtless under the half-collapsed ceiling, sweat streaking down his back, the air thick with sawdust and ash. The smell of burnt wood clung to everything, the studs, the floors, even his skin. Shadow moved quietly behind him, occasionally sniffing at piles of debris, tail low but alert. Jack had been pulling up sections of the old flooring, checking how deep the charring ran. The boards near the living room corner were worst blackened through to the joists. As he pried up another plank, a sharp bark split the silence. He looked up. Shadow stood rigid by the far wall, nose pressed to the floor, barking once, twice, then growling low. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. Shadow clawed at the spot, his nails scratching the char, whining now with urgency. Jack crossed over, crouched, and saw a faint discoloration beneath the ash, a patch darker than the rest, circular, shallow. He tapped it with the crowbar. The wood sounded hollow. Instinct took over. He pried the section loose, the plank splintering upward, releasing a puff of gray dust. Shadow stepped back but kept barking. Beneath the board lay a small cavity filled with soot and debris, a pocket the fire had not fully reached. Jack brushed it aside and froze. A melted lump of plastic lay there, faintly pink, warped and half consumed by fire. He lifted it carefully. It was the shape of a toy horse, the kind sold in dollar stores a decade ago, its mane molded in ridges, its eye blackened but still visible. He held it between his fingers, the smell of burnt plastic catching in his throat. The weight of it wasn't in ounces, but in years. He didn't know this house's children, but someone's daughter had played with this. Someone's life had burned here, too. He stared at the tiny thing, his vision blurring for a moment, not from smoke, but from the sudden rush of memory, the faint echo of a child's laughter, his own daughter's voice calling from another room 10 years ago. The two memories overlapped until he couldn't tell which was real. His chest tightened, the air thinning. He set the toy down and inhaled deeply through his nose, grounding himself. Shadow circled once, whining softly now as if sensing what had surfaced. Jack forced himself to keep working. He brushed deeper into the cavity and his fingertips struck something metallic. Another wire. He tugged gently, pulling free a section of cable wrapped in layers of gray tape. Not proper electrical tape, ordinary household adhesive. Beneath it, the copper had fused and split the insulation, burned to dust. It was a junction without a cap, wires twisted together bare, just waiting for heat to do its work. He didn't need a degree to know what it meant. He had seen it too many times, soldiers improvising field fixes that later failed homes, going up from shortcuts like this. He swallowed hard. His own house had the same wiring, the same brand, the same type of tape he'd once used to patch a loose line by the kitchen window. For years, he had believed that Fix's fix had doomed them. Now, staring at this, he wasn't so sure anymore. "You smell it, don't you?" he whispered to Shadow. The dog's ears flicked. Jack brought the wire closer to his nose. It carried a faint acrid scent, melted vinyl, and dust, the kind that clings to memory more than air. The same smell that haunted his nightmares. He remembered kneeling in the ashes of his old home, that identical scent clinging to his hands as he searched for remains. Back then he thought it was the smell of his sin. Now he understood it was the smell of something else entirely, something made by men who cut corners and hid the seams. He placed the wire and the toy side by side on the floor. The contrast struck him, innocence and negligence lying together under the same ashes. He rubbed a hand over his face, rough with dust and disbelief. His pulse drummed in his ears, steady but heavy. For a long while he didn't move. The late light through the broken window fell across the floor in pale stripes glinting off the exposed copper. Shadow lay down beside the toy, resting his muzzle near it, eyes half open. Jack's gaze drifted between the dog, the wire, and the faint scars on the wood. The villa wasn't just another burned building. It was a mirror. Everything he'd buried was resurfacing, pulled from the dirt, not by time, but by the nose of a dog who only followed what his master feared most. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the loose boards against the wall, and for a moment Jack thought he heard the whisper of flames in the sound. He looked toward the window where the sea reflected the dying sun in sheets of red and gold and felt the old fire stir inside him again. Not anger, not guilt, but something nameless rising from the smoke. That night Jack couldn't sleep. The wind had softened, but the quiet pressed against the villa like a heavy weight. He sat at the table under a single hanging bulb, the toy horse and burned wire laid out before him like pieces of evidence from a life he'd tried to bury. Shadow slept nearby, paws twitching as if chasing ghosts in his dreams. Jack reached for the duffel in the corner and unzipped it slowly. Buried beneath tools and folded shirts was a manila envelope creased with age. He hesitated before pulling it out. Inside were the documents he had kept hidden for a decade, the fire report, the photos, the insurance statement he never filed. He unfolded the main report carefully. The paper brittle edges yellowed. The county seal was still faintly visible in the corner. He had read it once years ago, but only up to the second page. After that, he couldn't. The rest of it felt like a verdict, and he had already sentenced himself. Now, under the dim light, he read every line. The report was cold factual. Origin living room southeast corner. Ignition likely caused by human negligence, open flame near wiring. He stopped at that word. Negligence. The letters seemed to pulse under the light as if alive. He could still see it, all the table, the lighter, the bottle half empty. He remembered striking the flame to light a cigarette he never smoked. Then came the flash, a spark from the wall, a noise like a snap of bone. He remembered turning, seeing the curtains catch the sudden burst of heat. The rest came in fragments, his wife's voice, the rush of smoke, the collapse. Every time he thought about it, he filled the blanks with guilt. He never asked if the wiring could have been faulty. He never wanted an excuse. Blame was simpler than wondering if it wasn't all his fault. He had believed that taking the punishment was the only way to honor what he lost. But now, as he looked at the photos attached to the report, the black streaks on the wall, the strange inward burn pattern, he noticed what he hadn't before. The marks were identical to what he had seen in the villa's outlet earlier that day. The same flow of heat, the same direction. It wasn't fire spreading from a lighter. It was fire drawn outward, born inside the wall. He set the photo beside the burned wire he'd pulled from the villa. The resemblance was undeniable. Same pattern, he whispered, his voice rough. Shadow lifted his head at the sound, ears pricked, then laid back down, trusting the quiet. Jack leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The room smelled faintly of salt and old smoke. He thought of how many nights he had replayed that fire in his head each time, punishing himself for not saving them, for being drunk, for letting his hand slip. But what if the fire had already been waiting? What if that spark, his spark, was only the trigger, not the cause? He pressed his palm to his forehead, trying to steady the rush of thoughts. 10 years he had lived inside that one sentence, human negligence, and never questioned what kind. He flipped through the pages again. Near the end, a line caught his eye. Electrical failure cannot be ruled out. However, evidence inconclusive due to extent of damage. He had never seen it before. He had never allowed himself to. He closed his eyes, a tremor running through his jaw. The truth had been there all along, written in the cold precision of a report he was too broken to finish reading. He folded the paper back into the envelope and stared at the table. The toy horse's melted surface glinted faintly, catching the bulb's weak light. It looked fragile, half-formed like memory itself. His chest ached, not with relief but with the sharp edge of possibility. For years he had been living under a false certainty, and now that certainty was cracking open, letting in something far more dangerous, doubt. Doubt that maybe he had condemned himself too quickly. Doubt that maybe the fire had been waiting for someone, anyone, to strike the match. He reached for his coffee, now cold, and stared at the surface. "What if I didn't burn them?" he said softly. The words hung in the air, foreign, almost sacrilegious. Shadow opened his eyes again, watching him, tail giving one faint thump against the floor. Jack leaned back, staring at the ceiling where moonlight slipped through the gaps in the boards. The wind returned, brushing against the windows with a low whistle, as if answering a question he hadn't dared to ask until now. Somewhere, deep inside the villa, a loose wire hummed faintly, a reminder that some fires never really go out, they just wait for air. By mid-morning, the sun hung bright and white over the coastline, the kind of light that made the world look washed clean but tired. Jack was on his knees in the living room pulling out another line of the old wiring when the crunch of gravel outside caught his ear. He figured the locals at the hardware store must have mentioned the Marine who was rewiring the burned villa. He looked up from the floorboards just as a man appeared in the open doorway, older, gray-bearded with a leather tool belt slung over one shoulder. "Didn't mean to sneak up," the man said, voice rough but friendly. "Saw your truck out front. You need a hand with that mess." Jack hesitated, studying him. The man had the look of someone who'd been fixing things his whole life, the posture of long work hands nicked and burned from years of sparks. "You an electrician?" Jack asked. "Used to be," the man replied with a small shrug. "Name's Harris. Live a few miles up the road. Retired mostly, but I can't seem to stay away from burnt wiring." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Jack nodded slowly, then motioned him in. "I could use a second opinion." Harris knelt beside the open wall, peering at the tangled remains of melted insulation. He whistled softly. "This is Western Electric's cable, isn't it?" Jack felt his pulse quicken. "That's what I've been told." Harris sighed, shaking his head. "That line should have been recalled years ago. I helped install miles of it back in the 70s and 80s, decent pay, bad material. Copper, too thin, insulation brittle. We used to joke it was fire waiting for a match." Jack's throat tightened. They knew it was bad. Harris wiped his hands on his jeans. "Some of us did. I tried to report it once, but the company didn't want the delay. They sent out a memo to patch and move on. I wouldn't sign the safety papers. Got pushed out a few months later." He looked up, meeting Jack's eyes. "We all have our ghosts, son. Mine just smell like burnt rubber." The words landed heavier than he meant them to. Jack looked back at the wires, the dull glint of exposed copper. How many houses? Harris let out a low breath. "Hundreds. Maybe more. Some caught fire. Some didn't. Luck of the draw." He paused, then added quietly, "You'd be surprised how many people lost everything before anyone admitted why." Jack's fingers tightened on the edge of the plank. He felt a tremor rise not from fear, but from recognition. "Did they ever fix it eventually?" Harris said, leaning against the stud. "New insulation, new code. But by then people had already moved on. The lawsuits never stuck. Too old, too messy. The company merged, changed names, vanished into paperwork. You know how it goes." He gave a humorless chuckle, then looked around the villa. "You find much left in here?" Jack hesitated. "Enough to tell me it started from inside." Harris nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "Yeah," he said softly. "Inside's where the worst fires begin. You can't always see the damage until it's too late." The room went quiet except for the distant sound of surf against rock. Jack studied the man's face, the guilt sitting behind his calm, the tired way he said "too late." "Why tell me all this now?" he asked finally. Harris looked at his hands, the skin lined like old rope. "Because people like me kept quiet when we should have spoken. Maybe talking now balances the scale a little." He stood brushing the dust from his knees and picked up a small piece of wire from the floor. "You ever see how this stuff melts? It doesn't spark, doesn't smoke much. It just heats until it eats itself. By the time you notice, everything's gone." He turned the wire in his fingers, the copper flashing dull red in the light. "You got a family?" The question caught Jack off guard. His voice came out low. "Had." Harris nodded once, reading more in the word than Jack said aloud. "Then you know what I mean," he murmured. "You try to do right, but the things you build can still betray you." Jack didn't answer. He watched the man tuck the wire into his pocket, a relic of something shared but unspoken. Harris looked toward the open window, the ocean beyond. "You keep working on this place," he said. "If you're replacing wiring, use copper rated for heat. Don't trust the cheap stuff. I can drop some by tomorrow if you want." Jack managed a small nod. "I'd appreciate that." Harris gave a short nod in return and started for the door. His boots left faint prints in the dust, each step measured deliberate. At the threshold, he paused. You ever lose sleep over something that wasn't your fault but felt like it was? Jack met his gaze. Every night, he said quietly. Harris nodded again as if that were answer enough. He stepped out into the sunlight, his footsteps fading down the gravel path. Behind him, Shadow whined softly, sensing the shift in his master's breathing. Jack reached out absently, his hand brushing the dog's head, his mind turning over the man's words. Some confessions come too late to save anyone except the one who listens. The attic was a forgotten space wedged beneath the fractured beams, where smoke stains still clung to the wood like veins. Jack had been avoiding it since the day he arrived, not because he feared what he might find, but because he feared what he wouldn't. Empty spaces reminded him too much of what was gone. That morning, with the air outside calm and the ocean murmuring below, he decided to face it. The ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed each rung, groaning in rhythm with his breath. Dust fell in small clouds as he pushed open the hatch. The air inside was dry, thick with the smell of old insulation and charred paper. He lifted the flashlight, its beam cutting through cobwebs that hung like strands of forgotten time. Shadow paced beneath him, whining softly, unwilling to follow into the narrow dark. Stay there, Jack murmured, his voice steady. The floorboards flexed as he stepped across, careful where the burn marks deepened. Near the far corner stood a metal trunk, half buried under debris. The lock was rusted, the lid warped by heat. Jack knelt, brushed off the ash, and pried it open. Inside were household papers the family had stored together, photo frames fused to glass utility bills, unsent letters, and receipts all reduced to soot. He sifted through them slowly until his fingers brushed paper thin, brittle, almost weightless. It was a letter, half burnt along the edges, the writing faded but legible. He recognized it instantly. The man who once owned this villa. Jack unfolded the letter with care, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The words were written in neat, deliberate cursive. To Western Electrics. Subject, urgent request for inspection. The wiring installed in our home appears faulty. We have experienced short circuits twice this month. Please send an inspector before the dry season. The date at the top made Jack's breath catch. It was sent 2 weeks before the fire. His eyes scanned the signature again, Elias Grant, and beneath it a faint smear of ash where the paper had burned. He read the lines over and over, the meaning sinking in like a slow tide. The man had seen it coming. He had tried to stop it. The company never came. Jack sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He imagined the owner writing this, the steady frustration of someone who just wanted to protect his home. He must have gone to bed believing help was on the way. Instead, his house turned to flame. Jack folded the letter carefully, setting it beside the burned toy horse and the section of faulty wire he had saved. The pieces formed a story without needing words, a warning sent ignored and buried beneath ash. He climbed down the ladder and spread the letter on the kitchen table under the same weak light that had seen him read his own fire report nights ago. The similarities were unmistakable. 2 houses, 2 fires the same, brand the same silence. He opened the envelope from his report and placed them side by side. The county seal on his The Western Electrics header on the other. 2 different tragedies stamped by the same invisible hand. Shadow padded over, resting his muzzle on the table's edge, eyes moving between the papers, as if sensing the shift in his master's heartbeat. Jack ran a hand over the dog's head absent-mindedly, his thoughts elsewhere. He picked up the letter again and noticed something beneath the soot, a second page shorter torn but still attached. It was a note from Grant's wife, scribbled at the bottom in a rushed hand. Elias, don't forget to send this before the rain. The lights flickered again. The ink had bled where a drop of water or a tear had fallen. Jack stared at the words until they blurred. He wondered if they ever got a reply or if the letter had simply sat in some office tray unacknowledged while the days ticked toward disaster. He imagined the same wind that blew through his home years ago, carrying the same faint smell of hot wire before the first spark. It was strange the way one man's past could live inside another's ruin. Jack traced the burnt edge of the paper with his thumb, the texture brittle and rough. He thought of Harris, the old electrician, and how his confession now had shape-proof. "You tried to warn them?" Jack whispered as if the house itself could hear. The wind moved through a broken window, lifting the edge of the letter slightly as though answering. Outside, the horizon was a thin silver line where sea met sky, and for the first time in a long while Jack felt the shape of truth taking form not as an accusation, but as a bridge between what he lost and what had always been hidden. He laid the papers flat on the table and stared until the words blurred into shadow. Somewhere deep inside, something that had been locked away for 10 years began to stir, not forgiveness yet, but its quiet beginning. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron. The air thickened with the scent of rain and salt, that heavy stillness that precedes a storm. Jack could feel it long before the first drop fell. The ocean below churned waves slamming into the rocks with growing anger, and the wind whistled through the broken rafters like a warning. He'd seen storms like this before, desert ones, with sand instead of rain, but the same tension, the same sense that something bigger was about to move through. He secured what he could shutters loose, boards, the ladder to the attic. Shadow followed him from room to room, restless, pacing, ears flat. The first thunderclap cracked above them, shaking the glass that was left in the frames. The backup lights flickered those he'd wired to a small generator, blinking once, twice, then went out. The villa sank into dim gray. Jack lit a lantern and placed it on the table. "It's just a storm," he said to calm himself as much as the dog. But deep down he could feel that familiar pulse, the quickening of breath, the body bracing for heat. He turned toward the hallway, checking the junction box he had been replacing. Another flash tore across the sky, followed by a crack so close it felt like the earth itself split open. The sound rolled through the villa like cannon fire. A moment later, the air smelled sharp electric. Then came the hiss. Jack spun toward the wall. Smoke curled from the outlet near the floor, thin at first, then darker. "Shadow," he barked. The dog was already moving, charging toward him, teeth bared in alarm. Jack dropped to his knees, the lantern light bouncing off the wall. The smoke was coming fast now, a faint orange glow blooming behind the metal plate. He grabbed a rag from the counter, dampened it in a bucket of rainwater leaking through the roof, and pressed it against the outlet. The fabric sizzled. His hand burned, but he held it there, pressing until the light died and the smoke thinned. Thunder boomed again, the villa trembling in its bones. He pulled the cloth away. The outlet was blackened, the wiring beneath fried completely. He sat back hard against the wall, breath ragged, the air thick with that unmistakable smell, plastic and ozone and fear. But this time, the fear didn't own him. His heart raced, yes, but it stayed within his control. He looked down at his hands, scarred, wet, trembling, and realized he hadn't frozen. He hadn't run. Shadow nudged his shoulder, whining, tail low. Jack let out a shaky laugh, almost disbelief. "You pulled me out of it," he said. The dog's head tilted, eyes wide as if to say it wasn't over yet. Jack grabbed the flashlight and checked every outlet, every switch, following the faint scent of smoke until he was sure it had stopped. The storm outside howled, wind tearing through the pines, rain pelting the windows like gravel. But inside the villa there was only the low hum of cooling wires. He wiped the sweat and rain from his face, moved to the window, and watched the sea thrash under lightning. Each strike illuminated the charred beams of the house, flashes of orange against black, a strobe of memory. 10 years ago he had stood in front of fire and failed to stop it. Tonight he had faced it again and won, not through luck, but through will. He sank to the floor beside Shadow, back against the wall, both of them breathing hard. The rain outside roared so loud it drowned thought. He closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of the storm in his chest, matching his heartbeat. There was no triumph, not exactly, only a deep, exhausted calm, a kind of quiet that comes after fear when you realize it no longer has power. The lantern flickered its flame, bending under drafts that snuck through the cracks. Jack looked at it for a long time, the small, steady fire reflected in his eyes. Once, flame had meant loss. Now, it meant endurance. He reached over, rubbed Shadow's fur, and said softly, "We're still here." The words weren't meant for anyone else. Outside, the thunder rolled again, but softer now, like a retreat. The storm was passing. He could smell the clean tang of rain through the broken frame, could hear the slow rhythm of water dripping from the ceiling into a rusted bucket. The house would need more work in the morning, but tonight something inside him had shifted. He leaned his head back, the sound of waves mingling with the soft rasp of the dog's breath beside him, and let the storm finish what it had come to do. The morning after the storm, the air smelled of salt and smoke mixed with rain. The villa stood damp, but standing its walls still humming faintly from the night's electricity. Jack moved through the rooms barefoot, checking every outlet, every switch, tracing the line of damage with slow, deliberate care. Each black mark on the plaster felt less like ruin and more like proof of survival, of endurance, of something turning. He was fixing a loosened wire in the hallway when he heard the rumble of an engine outside. The sound was old, heavy, familiar. He stepped to the porch just as Harris's pickup truck rolled up the gravel path, headlights still on though the sun had already risen. The old electrician climbed out his jacket, soaked at the edges, one hand holding the battered folder thick with papers. "You still alive up here?" Harris called, half a smile under his gray beard. That storm tore half the county apart. Jack nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "House took a hit, but it's fine." "Looks like you took a few hits yourself," Harris said, glancing at the burn on Jack's hand. "Lucky you were here to catch it." He patted the folder. "Brought you something." Inside the villa, the two men sat at the work table beneath the same weak light that had seen Jack's revelations night after night. Harris spread the papers out carefully. "Found these in an old storage unit I used to keep near the Western Electric subcontractor shop I worked for. Thought they were long gone." The pages were yellowed, stamped with the faded logo of Western Electrics. At the top of one sheet was a bold title, "Recall Notice Model WX74 Copper Core Insulation." Jack scanned the paragraphs, his eyes catching on the words "Thermal Instability Risk of Ignition Consumer Notification Optional." Harris tapped the paper with a calloused finger. "See that line, optional? Means they weren't required to tell anyone, not unless there'd been injuries. Most folks never knew their homes were wired with something ready to burn." Jack's jaw tightened, so they paid their way out quietly. Harris nodded. They settled a few claims out of court. Families who lost everything got checks that barely covered their walls. The rest never even got a letter. "I heard the company folded soon after. Changed its name, sold the assets, disappeared like smoke." He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "That's what corporations do. They don't hide evil. They hide paperwork." Jack picked up the notice again, his fingers tracing the embossed seal at the bottom. The words blurred for a moment, his thoughts louder than the rain still dripping outside. "You're telling me they knew," he said quietly. "Before my fire. Before this one." "They knew," Harris said, voice low, heavy, "but they didn't look close enough. And neither did the rest of us. We just kept working, signing what they gave us." He paused, eyes distant. We all looked away. Jack rested his forearms on the table, the rough skin of his hands catching the light. He said nothing for a while. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs filled the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You said once, everyone has ghosts." Harris gave a short nod. Jack looked down at his hands. "Mine isn't the fire anymore," he said. "It's that I thought it started inside me." Harris met his eyes, then gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe it did. But not the way you think. Some of us get burned because we stood too close, others because we carried the match too long." He reached into the folder again and pulled out one final sheet, an internal memo dated a decade after Jack's tragedy. "See here, audit confirmed liability, but the case was closed. Too late to help anyone back then." He slid it across the table. Jack didn't pick it up. He stared at it instead, the printed letters swimming in front of him like old ghosts. He realized something in that moment: there would be no trial, no villain to confront, no headline justice. Only the quiet truth of negligence spread across years and people who had chosen silence over conflict. Harris stood adjusting his jacket. "I thought you should know," he said simply. "I can't undo any of it, but maybe it helps you stop carrying the wrong kind of blame." Jack looked up at him. "It does," he said after a moment, "but it also means somebody still has to remember." Harris nodded, once his expression unreadable. "Then remember it right." He walked toward the door, the rain outside reduced to a light mist. Jack sat there long after the engine of the truck faded down the road. The recall notice lay open in front of him, the company's insignia half faded, the ink smudged by time. He ran a thumb over the printed words, feeling not anger, but something quieter, heavier, a kind of mourning for the years wasted on the wrong guilt. Shadow approached, nudging his arm, sensing the stillness. Jack let his hand rest on the dog's head, fingers brushing the coarse fur, grounding himself in the moment. The ocean roared beyond the cliffs, steady and indifferent. While inside the small house rebuilt from ashes, Truth sat quietly on a table waiting for him to decide what came next. Dawn came slow and pale, the kind of morning that doesn't break the night so much as wash it away. The storm had left everything rinsed clean, the villa's walls, the cliffs, even the air. The sky was the color of pewter, the ocean below, calm again, rolling in quiet rhythms against the shore. Jack sat on the stone steps facing the sea, a wool blanket over his shoulders, his hands cupped around something small and cold. The old lighter, the same one that had sat untouched in his drawer for 10 years, the one that once defined the worst night of his life. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of metal warmed by his skin. The hinge creaked faintly when he opened it, a sound so familiar it seemed to echo from another lifetime. The flame rose blue at first, then steady gold. It flickered in the wind, fragile but alive. He watched it for a long while, without fear, without guilt, just watching. The sound of the sea folded around him, the hiss of the waves mixing with the soft crackle of the flame. For the first time, fire didn't mean loss. It meant light. "I didn't burn them," he whispered, voice almost lost to the wind. "I just couldn't save them." Saying it out loud didn't hurt like he thought it would. The words didn't break him open. They settled quiet and real into the place where grief had lived too long. He closed the lighter gently, the small click cutting through the morning silence. The metal was worn corners, dented initials, faint but still visible under the soot. He had kept it all those years as punishment, a reminder carved in brass. Now it felt like something else, a relic of pain that had served its purpose. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and rain, sharp and clean. He walked to the edge of the rocks where the waves broke against the stone, and for a moment he hesitated. His hand shook not from doubt but from the enormity of what came next. He held the lighter over the small driftwood fire he had built on the rocks. The sun crested the horizon, then a thin strip of gold spilling across the surface, touching the flame of memory one last time. "You can rest now," he said softly, and dropped the lighter into the fire, watching the metal blacken and disappear under the controlled heat. Jack stayed there, eyes fixed on the widening ripples until they smoothed into calm again. He exhaled slowly, a sound closer to a sigh than relief, as if the ocean had taken not just the metal but the years that clung to it. Behind him, Shadow padded forward, pressing his head against Jack's knee. Jack let his hand rest there, fingers sinking into the thick fur still damp from the morning mist. The gesture was simple, wordless, but it steadied him more than anything else could. "We made it," he murmured. Shadow blinked up at him, eyes catching the light, amber turning almost gold in the sun. The moment stretched quiet and wide, no need for words, no need for apology. Seagulls wheeled above them, their cries cutting through the soft hum of the sea. Somewhere down the coast a church bell rang, once faint and far away. Jack watched the horizon shift from gray to silver to blue, the promise of another day he hadn't expected to have. The wind picked up, brushing against his face like a hand carrying the warmth of sunlight and the salt of tears he hadn't realized had fallen. He wiped them away with the back of his hand and smiled, small, unsteady, but real. The villa behind him gleamed faintly in the early light, its charred edges softened by gold like the world was offering a quiet apology. The repairs would continue, the walls rebuilt one beam at a time, but inside him, something heavier had already been restored. The sound of waves merged with the slow rhythm of Shadow's breathing as the dog settled beside him, head still on his thigh. Jack looked down at him and whispered, "It's over, buddy." Shadow's tail thumped once against the stone, a single beat that felt like acknowledgement. Together they sat there facing the sea, letting the morning unfold. Two survivors framed by silence and sunlight, the ghosts behind them finally quiet. Months turned quietly into a year of rebuilding, and now the villa no longer looked like a ghost on the cliff. The walls gleamed soft white under the afternoon sun, the roof rebuilt with patient hands, the windows open to the sound of the ocean. It wasn't grand, not the kind of place that made the papers, but it breathed every beam, every nail. Every brush of paint held the quiet pulse of something reborn. The scent of fresh wood mixed with salt and wildflowers from the hills. Inside, the air was filled with the soft clatter of tools, the laughter of people learning to mend things again. Jack moved through the room slowly, his steps steady, his shoulders lighter. On the door hung a bronze plaque that caught the sunlight every morning, Home of Light, for those who survived the fire. He had chosen the name not just for himself, but for anyone who had walked through flames, literal or not, and found themselves staring at what was left. The place was no longer his alone. Veterans from nearby towns came to work on the gardens, some missing limbs, others carrying the kind of scars you couldn't see. Fire survivors came to hands rough but willing, each of them, bringing fragments of loss that found quiet in the rhythm of rebuilding. Jack taught them how to hold a hammer steady, how to replace wiring safely, how to trust their own strength again. In return, they reminded him that healing wasn't a single act, it was a collection of small ones repeated until belief returned. The kitchen smelled of coffee and sawdust, the table scattered with drawings, blueprints, and mugs that never matched. On one wall, Jack had framed the half-burnt letter from Elias Grant, the man whose warning had gone unheard. Beneath it, in smaller frames, sat the recall notice Harris had given him. He had placed them there not as relics of guilt, but as reminders of truth, the kind that asks to be seen, not buried. Harris visited sometimes, his hands slower now, his eyes softer. He'd sit on the porch with Jack, both of them watching the tide roll in, saying little. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of things already understood. Shadow lay near the door, his muzzle now, grayer movements slower but still purposeful. He was the first to greet anyone who arrived, tail-thumping once in acknowledgement before settling back into his guard's rest. The children of visiting families adored him. They'd sit beside him on the porch steps, running their fingers through his fur as if petting something made of safety itself. Jack had learned to smile, watching them, the kind of small smile that came from peace rather than performance. One afternoon he stood by the window overlooking the sea. The light shifted through the glass, painting the floor in bands of gold and shadow. Outside, a group of volunteers was repairing a section of fence washed out by last month's rain. Their laughter drifted up through the air, easy and warm. He watched them for a long while before whispering almost to himself, "No one really survives fire completely. But if you can still rebuild it, means there's light left." His voice carried softly through the empty hall. The wind outside answered by brushing the curtains, stirring the scent of the ocean through the room. He turned and saw Shadow lying near the open door, eyes half-closed, ears twitching at distant sounds only dogs could hear. Jack knelt beside him, his knees creaking, and ran a hand over the old dog's head. "You kept us through it all," he said gently. Shadow opened one eye-tail, moving once, slow and content. The old rhythm of the waves filled the silence that followed. Behind them, someone began tuning a radio in the kitchen, an old song finding its way through static, a voice soft-worn, hopeful. Jack looked toward the sound and smiled. He walked out to the porch where the bronze plaque gleamed in the fading light. The letters caught the sunset, reflecting it in gold. He thought about the years before the guilt, the silence, the long road through fire and wind, and realized that nothing truly vanishes. What the flames take, the light can still return to, reshaped, quieter, but enduring. He leaned against the railing, the salt air filling his lungs. The waves rolled on, steady, eternal, and the villa behind him glowed faintly, a warm silhouette against the coming dusk. Inside, the lights flicked on one by one, soft yellow spilling through the windows like a beacon for the lost. And maybe that was what it had become, a home, not for the unbroken, but for those who had learned how to rise from ashes and carry the light forward. Shadow let out a low sigh, head resting on his paws, eyes still trained toward the horizon. Jack placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the slow rhythm of his breathing, the calm that had taken years to find. The wind shifted once more, bringing the faint echo of laughter from inside, and Jack turned toward it, the corners of his mouth lifting as he whispered, "We built it, boy. We finally built it." If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Which moment hit you hardest, the storm, the truth, or the final sunrise? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.